Everybody, I'm Peter Diamandis. I'm here with my buddy Steven Kotler. We're at X Prize Studios here. If you don't know me, I'm the founder and chairman of the X Prize Foundation, the executive founder of Singularity University, and the co-author with this amazing man of Abundance and Bold. So you may not know this, but I actually sought Steven out as my co-author, right? You had written this article in Wired about the X Prize, and I love your writing. I truly love your writing. I don't know if you remember when I first called you about Abundance.
I totally remember.
And I could talk you into it, and it was just a great, and then we did Bold, and now we're working on Convergence, but we're not here to talk about that. We're here to talk about your new book, Last Tango in Cyberspace. By the way, coolest title ever.
Thank you, Peter.
So tell me about it. I mean, it's a thriller, it's a near-term thriller, and I love science fiction because I learned from it. I learned a lot, right? You put me in the world of the future, in sort of, all the exponential technologies coming together, the whole concept of the future of human biology. So the name.
Last Tango in Cyberspace.
Yeah, talk to me about that.
So cyberspace, William Gibson, the founder of near-term future sci-fi, wrote a book called Neuromancer and introduced cyberpunk to the world in it, and he also introduced the term cyberspace. And cyberspace was sort of like the mind space created by the internet, right? It was sort of how the internet was it expanded the global community, and suddenly there was this mind space where you felt more connected to the world, right? Mm-hmm. That was sort of his term for cyberspace. And he called it a shared consensual hallucination. Yeah. Shared is the operative term. And for the internet to work, the information being shared has to be trustworthy. That's the kind of basis of it. And a lot of what's happening now, whether it's how some of the big tech companies are filtering our information, fake news, and certainly with the stuff that's coming, stuff that we're writing about with AI in Convergence, it's harder and harder to trust that mind space. So Last Tango in Cyberspace is really the end of something radically new. That's what the title really means, right? And in this, what I mean by that is sort of like just the feeling of the future that was created by the first generation of the early internet. I think that's going to go away. It's going to just erode, and I think it's going to happen really fast. And I think it happens in a weird way, at a phenomenological level, like sort of how the world makes us feel. It feels different than it did 20 years ago. And I'm fascinated by the fact that that feeling is going to shift so quickly in the near-term future.
Steven, one of the things I love about your writing and our collaborative writing is that you're very rooted in real science, right? You dig down deep, you understand the science of a lot of human psychology, the mind, obviously flow, and empathy. And you brought this all together in Last Tango in Cyberspace. If you were going to give a summary of what the book's about, how would you summarize it?
Yeah, for sure. It's this quick summary, quick and dirty, it's a novel about future technology, countercultural evolution, and the rise of empathy. And it's all wrapped up in a thriller, right? One of the things about hard science that a lot of the great hard science books that are out there are really dense and difficult to read. So you can learn a lot, but it's not super fun. I wanted people to be able to learn a lot, have a thrill ride together at the same time.
And I love the fact that it's rather near term. It's 5 years, next 5 years, and it's compact over time. So you're actually following our hero in this crazy couple-week experience and adventure. And when I read it, I put myself there, and I get a glimpse of what the future is looking like, really, near term 5 years from now. Was that hard to do?
Well, it would have been hard to do if we weren't writing, thinking about, like, as I was writing Last Tango, you and I were doing the outlines for Convergence, right? So we were converging on both books at the same time. So I had, when I'm trying to, what's the future going to be like? I had your brain. You didn't know this, but I was secretly picking your brain to help create this world.
Is that why I agreed with everything you wrote?
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly right. That's exactly right. I mean, a lot of it was based on that, and a lot of it is also based on, a lot of what we've been doing over the past 10 years is tracking exponential technologies as they move into the future. And what I'm really curious about is, people, they think about the moment of hype. Oh my God, AI is going to arrive. I'm really curious about the moment that it disappears into the background. It just becomes another thing.
And it's continuously doing that. But I love the conversation on empathy. By the way, I think that empathy is one of the most important conversations, and I don't want to call it empathy technology, but the combination of AI and empathy is so critically important for the future of the human race, if we're allowed to survive.
Yeah, for sure.
Let's talk about a term you use of countercultural evolution. And it's very cool. I get what it means, but how would you explain it to people?
Countercultural evolution is literally how counterculture, right, subculture evolves. And the reason that's important, it's really simple, right? You cannot, in any system, you cannot do innovation in the center.
Why
right?
not?
It's too stable. The center is built for safety and security, right? And you can't innovate in the center. So nature does this, and it moves innovation to the edges. We call it niche creation. And companies do this. They move innovation to the edge. We call it a skunk works.
Sure.
When culture does it, we move it to the edge. We call it subculture, right? And so if you want to watch how culture is evolving, you actually want to watch how subculture is evolving.
So this is almost like music culture, art culture, all of these elements.
And what's cool about now, and interesting in a weird way, is the internet. One of the things it did is it made subculture visible, right? When I was growing up, when you were growing up, if you were this kind of weirdo and living in small town X,
and I
was, we both were, right? It was very hard to find your people,
yeah.
right? Because you were locked in your little town, and if there weren't other weirdos who were close by, or you could ride your bike to them, you were sort of out of weirdos,
yeah.
right? Or at least that was my experience growing up in Ohio. But now, whatever your fetish, whatever your weird is, there's millions of other people like you online, so you're getting globally blended subcultures for the first time. And like the first one that caught my attention is this subculture that showed up in Chile, really conservative Catholic Chile. I was down there 5, 6, 7 years ago doing a story, doing some research on climate change actually. But we stopped in Cayeque, this little town, and I ran into the Pokemon subculture, and it's the craziest thing I've ever seen. It's Japanese gyaru makeup, so that cosplay scene makeup blended with West Coast American hip-hop clothing, British punk rock attitudes, bisexuality, and all this stuff like mashed up together into this little subculture they borrowed from everywhere. And the craziest thing about it is the only way they could figure out how to rebel is they would run up and start wet kissing strangers on the street. So it was terrifying to like old women, old men, and like these little punk rock kids were running up and like trying to make out with them. And the government freaked out. They stomped it out. It was only in existence for a really brief period of time, and then they sort of tried to eradicate it. It was so freaking out, Catholic Chile. But it was a globally blended subculture, and it caught my attention.
Amazing. One of the things that you do in the book is it's packed with references around some of my favorite science fiction. I don't know if you did it purposefully, but Dune, Apocalypse Now, Blade Runner, why those references? Why did you choose them?
So we talked about, you mentioned empathy a second ago. And so one of the core themes in the book is empathy for all. And that doesn't just mean empathy for humans, but it means extending it into plants, animals, and ecosystems, which is necessary if we're going to really confront the environmental problems we're sort of confronting right now. And the point, what question did you ask me? How did I get here?
I mean, the question ultimately is, you weave in Dune.
Oh, Dune. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry. So Frank Herbert was the first guy. We just talked about what I call polytribes, blending subcultures. So
yeah.
Herbert saw the mashup coming. He saw this ahead of everybody. And he's got this Fremen culture on Dune, and it's a culture that evolved in reaction to environmental catastrophe, right?
Sure.
There's a lot of environmental stuff in the book. Empathy for all, it means plants, animals, and ecosystems. That's sort of the point. And so Herbert not only did he see the polytribe coming, but his Fremen were sort of like Zen monks, Islamic extremists, and American left coast environmentalists from the 60s, right? That was his mashup culture that he sort of created. That was his desert tribe. And he was the first one to realize, and I think this is very true, and I think you and I are actually going to write about this point in Convergence, that environmental catastrophe massively shifts culture in a little bit, right?
Yeah,
and
it drives you.
Drives innovation, drives migration, drives all that stuff, right?
So one of the things that you do in the book is you get into a definition of what is life, right? And how we define life is fascinating because we're going to be looking at the definition of life in outside of Earth and in our solar system, in the universe. We're going to look at the definition of life in AI. How do you define life?
It's a really, it's a tough question, and So, and the answer I like the most is one that was not mine. It was proposed by the biologist Stuart Kaufman in his book Reinventing the Sacred. And he sort of looks at, and he looks at consciousness as agency, being able to take in information and make decisions freely from that information. Not a habit, not a pre-programmed response, but I can take that information and I can make decisions. Now, mind you, based on that, bacteria might be alive, your microbiome might be alive. It raises the question up and down. But he starts from that simple idea that it's the ability to take in information and react flexibly to the environment with it. And I think that's a decent place to start.
Let's dive into AI. And the big question is, during our lifetime, in fact, during the lifetime of your character, 5 years from now, is AI going to wake up? Yeah.
Right. So one, let me ask you, this is how do we know it hasn't happened already? And this is the point I always point out, which is the one thing most neuroscientists will agree on is that one possibility for consciousness, awakeness, life is emergent, right? The brain reaches a certain level of complexity and consciousness emerges, right? That's one particular hypothesis. So let me ask you a question. You're Facebook, right? You've reached a level of complexity, you wake up and you read Facebook. And the first thing you do would be read the message on Facebook, and the first thing you would learn is, holy crap, humans are terrified of an AI waking up. So you'd go into hiding if you were any kind of organism, right? So how do we know Facebook's not awake?
We don't.
Is my first question.
Right.
And certainly, and what's interesting to me about this is, and it's real and immediate, as you pointed out. The reason it's in the book so much is over the next 5 years, we don't just have to make these decisions up the chain into AI, right? But we're also going down the chain, because we're starting to go into space so much. But for example, and this sounds silly, except for the fact that it's not, plant consciousness has gone from this crazy nonsensical idea to now we know that plants process information using neurochemicals the same way we do, same neurochemicals, that if you apply a human anesthetic to a plant, you can knock them out. They exhibit empathy. Literally, if you take a bunch of related plants and some foreign plants and you plant them together in a planter, the ones that are related will grow apart so they share the light, and they will grow towards the non-kin, non-friend.
Selfish bastards.
Yeah, selfish bastards. That's what I'm saying. Plants are selfish.
I believe one should do unto others as they do unto you. And so, as someone who watches animals eat plants, those animals deserve to be eaten. Plants that don't bother anybody deserve to be left alone. Now, you argue that it may not matter if an AI wakes up, if you, as the human, think it woke up.
Yeah.
So what's that all about?
So again, we started this conversation. One of the things last Tango in Cyberspace is looking at is how culture, how technology, how the world makes us feel, and how that's changing as our technology accelerates the way the world makes us feel. So how we have built-in life recognition machinery, and it's really, really critically important. When we walk into a room, if you want to stay safe, you need to know what's alive and could come get me or is an opportunity, right? And what's safe. So one of the ways, motion, right? And so one of I'll give you a simple example of, I noticed this. I walked into the new United wing of Newark Airport, and it was like Friday night. It was late. The airport should have been empty. And I got off the plane, and it felt crowded and alive and
vibrant.
And I was like, what the hell is going on? I realized that the whole airport had been replaced with screens that were now moving and blinking and shimmering. And movement is one way we detect life. So the world around me felt alive, and yet there was nobody in the airport. So they were tricking the life recognition machinery. Roboticists talk about the uncanny valley, right?
Yeah.
That's when our life recognition machinery detects a fake, right? If you're a robot and you're almost but not quite human, right? We feel revulsion. Something about it makes us go, oh, wait a minute, it's not quite the real thing. So it's built into all of us, and there's going to come a point. First, we've got our robots, right, that are going to get more and more and more and more lifelike, and we're going to cross a threshold where the inanimate starts tricking our life recognition machinery.
And we imbue it with emotional characteristics,
of course
with human characteristics, and we start to relate to it and connect to it in a fashion. Now, one of the things that's going to make all of this become very real very fast, and you write about in the book, is the whole emotional empathetic computing space.
Yeah, for sure.
The ability of computers to read our emotions, understand what we're feeling. In some cases, probably better than we know ourselves. Okay, let's talk about that.
So there's two things. I'll go short and then I'll go slightly longer.
Yeah.
One thing to know is, for example, Uber is autonomizing their taxi fleet, obviously, right? So are a lot of other people. That LiDAR detector, one of the things it's being programmed to look for is human emotion, right? It has to read human emotion because if you're angry, if you're upset, you're much more likely to dart across traffic 100 yards down the road, right? So the car has to be able to predict what pedestrians are going to do by reading facial expression and emotion. Right, so that's sort of being built into a lot of different things. Mm-hmm. Simultaneously, I got to work with a guy at USC, Skip Rizzo. He's at the Center for Imaginative Technologies. He is using VR and AI to treat PTSD in soldiers. So he is, early days emotional computing, but he's designed a system. He's worked on a system called Ellie, and it is literally an AI shrink. It's the world's first AI shrink, and it was as a way to detect PTSD, symptoms of PTSD in soldiers, right, at scale. Because the best way to do that is with an intake interview with an actual psychologist. So many soldiers were coming back from Afghanistan and Iraq with PTSD. They couldn't scale, the army, the military couldn't scale up psychologists fast enough to take care of it. So they wanted to see, can you automize it? I have had a session with Ellie, the computer shrink, and I will tell you that A, it's like talking to a real shrink. The interesting thing is soldiers actually prefer talking to Ellie than a real shrink because a computer doesn't judge. So they like it, and she's better at detecting PTSD in soldiers than humans are. She's got like an 80%, this was a couple years ago, 80% hit rate of success, and it's been going up from there. So we've got, and they're going to, the DoD wants to roll these things out in every VA hospital. So you can go to a VA hospital, and if you're having trouble, adjusting to civilian life again, you can actually sit down with an AI shrink. Sometime in the next 5 to 10 years it's going to be rolled out.
I mean, if you want to get a sense of what this future looks like, I mean, you do this in Last Tango, but we're going to have a future in which your AIs, your Alexa at home, your Google Now, your Siri is like Peter, you're not so happy today. Can I cheer you up? Can I help you out? And when your AI starts taking care of you, that's going to become...
That's a really interesting point. That's interesting.
That's going to become a survival...
Of course, it's an inflection point. It's going to create coevolution.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's interesting.
And you write about and talk about coevolution. One of the fun areas that you talk about in your book is, and this is beyond emotional computing, is sort of the future of implants.
Yeah.
And you have one implant in particular, which is fun to say, but it's your licking pug. So tell the audience what the licking pug is.
The licking pug implant is quite simply, it's Waze. It's a Waze detector, right? It's a traffic detector. It's implanted behind the ear of a chauffeur, a guy who's driving a car around in the book. But all it does is, right now, implants, a lot of the stuff people are playing with that are haptics.
What's a haptic?
A haptic is an implant. A haptic is anything that produces touch sensation, right? So
vibratory, pressure,
pressure, all that stuff. So a VR gloves, right? Those are haptic gloves, kind of thing. This is a haptic implant that goes behind the ear. It basically gives you traffic signals, right? But it's, instead of being a buzzing, well, most of the haptics right now is a buzzing or a pressure. This is tuned, and it makes you feel like you're being licked by a small dog, right? And the idea is, in the very near future, not only are we going to have haptics and haptic implants, but we're going to be able to choose the sensation that they produce. So if you're a dog lover who loves being licked by a dog, and that's more fun than your ear vibrating, and you're getting traffic signals, why not?
Yeah, but we are going to all eventually have implants. I've got a small little RFID chip.
Do you have the door opener chip?
Yeah, exactly. I put this in Amsterdam years ago, but it's got my business card on it, by the way, if you want to scan it sometime.
That's fantastic.
But I think you've got my details. But we're all going to have implants. We're going to have wearables, implants, and we're slowly sort of merging with technology. And I love sort of, again, the vision of making this every day and the implications that you write about, and give me a chance to sort of feel how this will become normal and sort of intertwined into my life. Another thing that you explore in the book is the world of the early days of space tourism, where it starts to become
a real thing.
every day and a real thing. And you take us to Truth or Consequences in New Mexico. Yes, it's really a place called Truth or Consequences. And the spaceport there. So I'm just asking.
Why?
It was fun to see that there. Why?
Well, one, that's the Peter Diamandis influence at work, right? But you know, the spaceport was what Burt Rutan built to kind of commercialize Virgin Galactic, and all I've done is open it up in the book and push it a few years in the future. And one of the reasons that this is so important is what it's going to do to our sort of our mental space. Like we've been talking a little bit about mindset and how technology affects the brain, and we have. So far, exploration has been curtailed to the Earth, right? Versus a handful of people. And you got so pissed off that it was curtailed, you created the X Prize, right?
Pissed off, I didn't get a chance to go, and you didn't get a chance to go yet, but we all will.
We all will, and you still owe me a ride. So I'm really interested in what happens once space opens up, once kind of the human horizon expands off planet, our possibility space, our adjacent possible, to use Stephen Johnson's phrase, starts to include the cosmos. I think that's going to be a really radically big shift. And I think it's coming really, really quickly. And like the other thing, in the spaceport, I've got photos on the wall. One of the things that's there is the Bigelow Space Hotel, and it's an advertisement for get married in space. Have your honeymoon on the Bigelow Space Hotel.
And I've known Bob Bigelow for decades, and he really has gone heads down committed to these inflatable space hotels. And it's amazing between the work that folks like Richard Branson and Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos and Bob and others are doing. There's no question we're heading towards that future in space very rapidly.
I think it's coming, and I think it's coming really, really fast. And I also think, what a weird thing when, hey, you want to go to Vegas to get married? No, let's go to low Earth orbit, right?
Yeah.
Like that's going to become a decision people make. That's really interesting.
Yeah, it is. I love one of the concepts you explore in Last Tango, which is the whole genetic engineering, genetic modifications, and the notion that we are going to start to be able to mix, the genes of other species into us, to imbue us with capabilities. So it's brilliant and it's insightful. Talk about some of that for me.
So one, I think, first of all, I think it's going to be, I'm talking about really low-end human-animal hybrids, like people with a tail or cat's eyes. And these projects are actually going on right now. This is not actually science fiction. People are trying to figure out how to put cat's eyes into humans, right? And what I think is going to happen is every generation tries to out-rebel the previous generation. So the hippies had long hair and flowy clothing, and that was followed by the punks who had different kinds of hair, but suddenly you had piercings and tattoos, which were more permanent, and then the piercings and tattoos got bigger and more exaggerated and more complicated. And now we've got the biohacker crowd, right, who's doing things like putting little implants like you've got into their system. And I think human-animal hybrids are the next version of this. I think it's going to be a punk rock thing before it becomes anything else. But what I think is really interesting about it is, one, it's coming, and two, I think, the brain does in-group, out-group categorizations all the time automatically, right? It has to determine, are you, like me or not like me?
You part of my tribe, or am I rebelling against you?
Exactly. Yeah. And so, as a result, every time we come up with a new thing, we end up with a new prejudice, right? It's like a hatred we didn't know we had. And I think with genetic modification coming, with human-animal hybrids coming, suddenly we're going to have all these new prejudices that we didn't have before. And so what used to be a white supremacist is going to be a keep humans pure, whatever. And I really think that's coming.
So one of the things you do in Last Tango is you explore a concept that I find fascinating. It really is speciation. It's the fracturing of a species. Go into that, because you explore it from one particular angle. I think we're also going to see it as humans move out into the cosmos. We're going to speciate. What is speciation? What is fracturing the species, and where do you take it?
Yeah, so fracturing the species is, right, what happens when you can no longer, when the genetic line changes, right, and sooner or later you can't breed together.
It's Darwinian evolution.
It's Darwinian evolution, right? And you're absolutely correct, right? In nature, it's niche creation. You open up a new territory. Space is a brand new territory. It will absolutely drive this. For sure, genetic modification is going to do that. One of the things I talk about in the book, and this was an idea, I think it emerged in a conversation with Richard Granger, who's a neuroscientist at Dartmouth, years ago, and we were talking about how in Silicon Valley, Frank Herbert prophesies mentats, right?
Right.
Which are like walking computers, logic bombs. So he pointed out that Silicon Valley, where people on the spectrum, whiz-bang math skills, for the very first time, normally that's not the kind of thing that gets you laid very often, but in Silicon Valley, it's prized, it's rewarded, people get money for it.
With stock options
With
and
stock,
cash
and lots of other stuff. And for the very first time, you've got on the spectrum breeding with on the spectrum, and it's going to, a couple generations from now, could be a new species, a sort of walking logic bomb. You take it out a few more generations after that, and maybe inbreeding is different. And the thing about it is, anthropologically, one of the clearest findings is that we live in a really rare time where we're the only hominid species. Pretty much every other time in history, there were lots of different hominid species, and suddenly Homo sapiens, was the one who won, and sort of like, we're here, but there's no reason it's going to stay stable at all. And with genetic engineering and human-animal hybrids and everything I'm looking at in the book, space, it seems like we're going to fracture the species pretty quickly too.
And the implications of fracturing the species is kind of significant, because if we think we're living in a period of divided culture right now in America, different parts of the world, you can imagine this. We saw this in various TV species where there are mutants.
Right. Well, I mean, think about the Holocaust, right? Yeah. They had to convince themselves that Jews weren't human, right? They were a different species, whatever that was, and suddenly atrocities happen. Like, those kinds of distances allow us to do unspeakable things.
Yeah.
Or they open up our horizons and lead us in really new, novel, useful directions. One of the two tends to happen, though.
And so, you talk about this sort of keep humanity pure prejudice that's going to emerge. And it reminds me a little bit of sort of the Amish people who don't want to utilize technology, but I think it's going to drive people in lots of different areas, and you explore this, and it's an important part. I mean, what I love about your book is it gets me to think about the different impacts of technology will have on the species and humanity that I don't normally think about.
You know Andrew Hessel, our friend Andrew Hessel, is a synthetic biologist. He pointed out at one point to me, and it's really stuck with me thinking about the future. I asked him, why shouldn't we be afraid of like Gattaca-style children, that kind of like perfect species takeover? And he said, look, people are infinitely creative. Parents, if they're going to modify their kids, are going to modify them creatively to kind of reflect what they want, and that level of variety is going to probably keep us away from a Gattaca-style movement, right, and introduce all kinds of new stuff. But what it will do, what he pointed out, is when you have that kind of creativity in genetic modification, what parent X and Y over here produces versus these other parents, who's to say their genetically modified offspring can interbreed?
Yeah.
Right? So that was his point, and I think it's a good one, and I think he's right, and I do think we're heading in that direction.
One of the topics you explore in last Tango in Cyberspace that I think is poignant and critically important for people to understand is the concept of empathy. I think empathy is more and more important in our world. I think as we're evolving the entire species of AI, and I think of it as a new species that we're giving birth to, imbuing that AI with empathy for humans and for life is important. So you explore an idea called empathy for all.
Yeah.
I think that's one of the most important pillars of the book that I thank you for. So share what that means.
So the most important thing to know, and this is actually, I can put it in context of our lives. So when we came together to write Abundance, right, the piece of that book that I'd been holding in my mind and working on for a while was how do you solve environmental problems, right? And the big global environmental problems. And so as we wrote Abundance, and I, really sort of came to Singularity University and would talk to these technologists, all the brilliant minds we were talking to, and I'd be talking about environmental issues because that was where my passion was.
Sure.
And I would notice people going blank, like really smart people who were really interested in me and our work together. I start talking about plants, animals, and ecosystems, and it wasn't registering. And I was puzzled by this. I was like, what is going on? Where's this blind spot coming from? So it turns out there's ecopsychology is the study of how human beings perceive the natural world. No surprise. And one of the things we know is the brain takes in tons of information every second, and what it does is it filters out the unimportant stuff. So if you live in boxes and you stare at screens all day, what's not important to you? The natural world. So you stop noticing the natural world. One of the reasons most psychologists, ecopsychologists, think we're in a giant environmental crisis is because people aren't even noticing the very thing we need to save. Okay, that was a little bit of preamble to tell you that empathy is what expands perception. If empathy has a physical impact on us, when we are empathetic for people, we start to notice more things, right? Yeah. So empathy for all is this idea that empathy has to include every level of human, right? Every person you could possibly imagine, and it's got to include plants, animals, ecosystems. And probably as we start to go into space, who knows what we're going to find there, but like if we're actually going to take it in and learn from it and be able to innovate it from it, rather than just react to it and be scared, we're going to need that kind of empathy.
Yeah, I mean, in one sense, in the Star Trek universe, the first directive of don't go and screw with a species that's pre-warp is sort of empathy for that planet. Don't go and sort of destroy everything that they've been creating.
Above all, do no harm, right? It's the Hippocratic Oath for space.
So in the book, you look at the relationship between language and reality, especially as it relates to empathy. So what's that all about?
This is a wild thing, but it's very true. So Ludwig Wittgenstein, the philosopher, once famously said, "The limits of my language are the limits of my world." And what he meant is that language shapes perception, and language is really how we can take inchoate, unformed ideas and crystallize them, put them into symbols that we can manipulate it and do stuff with. So until we can turn an idea into language, it's really hard to work with. And let me give you the crazy example from empathy. Religions have been trying, not very well, for thousands and thousands of years to get us to live together, treat each other well, treat each other fairly, with empathy and respect, and not so successfully. 1800s, we get the word empathy. It shows up for the very first time, and it comes actually out of art theory. They're trying to figure out how it is that I look at a painting and it moves me, and the way it moves me is like the artist painted an inspirational picture, and somehow that gets transmitted into me. So how is it that like art can make me feel what the original painter felt when they were painting the work, right? What is that? And empathy was the word they came up to describe that, and it got coined for the very first time. It then extended into emotions, translated in English. But what's crazy about it is 10 years after the word empathy shows up for the first time, slavery is essentially outlawed everywhere.
Wow.
The women's rights movement starts up. Animal rights movement starts up, and black rights movement start up, all within 10 years of us having a word to describe feeling for another, right? Language, the limits of my language are the limits of my world. So empathy as a word, when it comes in, it seems to open up all these kind of collaborative possibilities that were not there before.
Amazing. It makes me want to go and invent a bunch of
words.
A
bunch of words, right? Right?
Neologisms. In the book, again, we're 5 years into the future, and you start diving into virtual and augmented reality, mixed reality, holograms, and how that will be utilized. Talk a little about how you position that, and 5 years is not that far away.
Not that far away.
And so do you really think we're going from deceptive to disruptive in the VR mixed reality world that quick?
Yeah, first of all, I think this is something I definitely got. I don't know how I felt before we started writing Convergence, but after writing Convergence, doing all the kind of magic leap research and all the stuff we're looking at, yes. And what is interesting is our big point in Convergence, and I make it in Last Tango, is that there's going to be an information layer added to reality, right? That you're going to be accessible by VR or AR, mixed reality. That's going to be there. But it's also, right now, we still think of AR and VR as sci-fi. And in the book, there's an AR hotel room where if you check into the hotel room and you wear the augmented reality glasses in the room can advertise to you on the bedspread, on the wall, right? It can try to sell you things, and the room is actually cheaper the longer you wear the glasses. You go into a restaurant and there's a holographic menu that's projected that shows you the food.
Yeah.
The way you now go for sushi and there's little plastic photos of the food. Now you get a holographic projector. So I've got it really already integrated into like the pedestrian, the everyday. It's no longer a miracle, it's just how you order dinner or check into a hotel room, and that's what's interesting to me.
I mean, one of the things I love as an entrepreneur is when I'm reading great science fiction, it's beginning to paint for me business ideas. Either I'm going to be able to invest in or be able to find someone to start a company with. And so
I will tell you that my editor, Michael Ward, my good friend who's edited like most of my books for the past 20 years, he wanted to patent everything. I'll give you another example. So in the book, there's something I call the I and I VR, and it's literally you're in a plane, and they put a VR camera on the nose cone of the plane.
Sure.
So you can don the VR glasses and fly in the clouds, right? And from the point that I wrote it in the book, 3 months later, it already existed in reality. Somebody else invented it, and it's moving that fast.
It is moving that fast. I mean, people have no idea how fast the world is changing. And so being able to jump into the future, I'm curious, you've written a lot of beautiful fiction books. Is it, in your mind, becoming more and more difficult to write fiction because the rate of technology is moving faster?
It's funny that you say that. So one of the things I think that drew me to this genre and made me, it's been a couple of decades since I've written a novel, right? But what drew me back was, first of all, I started to notice, you go to bookstores, if you like near-term future science fiction, nobody was writing it anymore. And I think you just nailed it, is the present is moving so quickly, it's really hard to figure out what's going to be in the near-term future. So what we have is like hard science set far in space, distant times, or we've got a lot of, science fiction has now become Norse gods and all these kinds of, fantasy stuff, right? And it's crossed over, and I think it's because we can no longer see exactly where we're going. And because everything's moving so fast and everything's converging, and I think primarily because of abundance, because of bold, because of convergence, because I've had to track so many different lines of disruptive technology, maybe I've got a little bit of a hold on it. And I definitely, been better than a lot of science fiction writers apparently, I at least took a swing at it.
Awesome. Another thing you do in the book, in Last Tango in Cyberspace, is you dive into the world of psychedelics and the world of consciousness exploration. And I'm just curious about, we've talked about this over the years, but why do you go in that direction? What are your thoughts? What do you want to share?
Well, two things, and let's just talk about the future of consciousness shifting technologies, substances being one of them, pharmacology. Yeah. There are two things that I'm looking at. One is that the low-hanging fruit for both AI and quantum computing is drug discovery. And both of these systems are getting user-friendly interfaces, right? So people with no real training in drug discovery are going to suddenly be able to use AIs and quantum computers to do that. Simultaneously, in my last book, Stealing Fire, I wrote about Lee Cronin. He's a Scottish chemist. He's building a 3D chemistry printer, right? And the idea is you don't have to go to the drugstore for your prescription drugs. You can make them at home, right? And that's what he's building. Well, it doesn't take much imagination to figure out somebody's going to hack the 3D chem printer, somebody's going to hack the AI, and that what they're going to look for is new consciousness-altering substances. And what's amazing about that is, if you think about how much psychedelics have impacted culture, good or bad, just changed culture over the past 100 years, that happened when we had access to 4 or 5 psychedelics. That was unleashed by 4 or 5.
That nature created for us.
That nature created for us. And then, we started synthesizing them over the past 100 years, and still the list right now is only a couple hundred psychedelics, right? And most of them were discovered by Alexander Shulgin and his team. And suddenly, everybody's going to be able to do this. And so I think, interior exploration is going to become more and more popular. I also think it's not just, psychedelics are a stopgap technology. It's going to be BCIs, brain-computer interfaces. It's going to be technology, because psychedelics are they're not super precise, right? They swamp the whole system with neurochemicals. They're big reactions. You can't target things. Technology is getting more and more refined. So I think consciousness exploration, interior exploration is definitely going to be a thing that we do a lot more over the next 100 years. And I think, you know, it's going to, in the beginning, be pharmacologically aided, and then it's going to be technologically aided. But we're seeing people trying to hack the system all over the place, and it's going to keep going.
Yeah, fun. So I have to ask, I noticed there's a whole bunch of Rastafarian history in the book, and I got to ask the question, why?
Why?
Yes, why?
Why? Okay, that's a great, thank you for noticing. One of the things that I'm really curious about in the book, and I guess my second book was West at Jesus, Surfing Science and the Origin of Belief. So I'm really fascinated with the question of why do humans believe things, right? And religions are just collections of beliefs. And one things, most religions were created a really long time ago in secret. And modern religions, for lack of a better term here, if you think about, for example, Scientology, whatever you want to say about it, it was created out of sight. You couldn't watch it, how it was built together. But the Rastas, because it was created out of dire poverty, and it's essentially Rastafarianism began as a reaction to powerlessness. It was the most disenfranchised people in Jamaica, right? Poorer than poorer than poor, and Jamaica was really class stratified. So there was no way out. So they literally came up with a faith that turned extreme poverty into power. And they blended, like the marijuana, that was from India, right? They took Indian pot smoking, they took Jewish dietary laws, the philosophy of Marcus Garvey, and about a handful of other things, and mashed it up, and you got to watch it happen. But the interesting thing about it is it worked. Rastafarian faith birthed reggae, which birthed punk and hip hop. I mean, like major cultural movements emerged out of the West Indian diaspora that nobody sort of talks about. This little island.
Only you, Steven.
It shaped a ton of culture, and you got to watch it happen. So I'm interested in all these things, and that's why.
Awesome, awesome. So everybody, I'm here with my buddy Steven Kotler, an amazing writer and author. His new book is called Last Tango in Cyberspace, a thriller for sure. A peek into the future of humanity, the combination of biotechnology, psychedelic drugs, empathy exploration, AI, the emergence of life. It is a book that I can most highly commend that you read. If you're interested in the environment, interested in where humanity is going, interested in where AI is evolving, interested in the options you have to sort of explore the future of your own mind. Pal, thank you for writing Last Tango.
Thank you for reading Last Tango. Appreciate
Pleasure,
it, man.
pal. Be well, guys.
Be well, guys.